Welcome to White Rabbit Podcast, a Thelema broadcast, a podcast dedicated to discussions on life from the perspective of those who accept the law of Thelema. My name is Gwen Gunther, and I am your podcast hostess today. Joining me is internationally known author, artist, and speaker, J. Daniel Gunther. Picking up from our last podcast, where we had a general discussion on the averse point of view of Thelema, today we're going to talk about what has been generally classified as an Egyptian netherworld text that emerged from an unconventional time in Egypt's history. The Amarna period, which was ruled by Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, who later changed his name to Akhenaten, a pharaoh who ruled during the 18th dynasty. Specifically, this text, found on the sarcophagi and stone walls of the king's tombs, has been titled the Book of Gates. It is a nautical journey through the 12 hours of the night in ritualistic form that dramatize the deceased passage through the pylons and unlock the mysteries of each hour. Originally, it was the burden of the prior ruler of Egypt after the rites of embalming to make a safe passage through the 12 hours of the night in the boat of Ra. The netherworld that I am referring to is also known as the Duant. Those familiar with Egyptology will recognize this word as, generally, the abode where the gods, the pharaoh, and eventually the justified deceased, called true of voice, pass through after death. To clarify, true of voice was a title given to the deceased Egyptian, whether male or female, whose heart had been judged and found free of sin through the weighing of the heart in the scales of Mot, in the domain of Osiris, in the hall of the double truth. In a lecture given by Daniel for the introduction to his forthcoming book called The Visions of the Pylons, a magical record of exploration in the starry abode, Daniel gave a general explanation of this mysterious place. Quote, "Today I would like to discuss a very old and mysterious subject, the Duant, the so-called netherworld. From the very beginning of Egyptian history, we see how they believed that the gods and goddesses, as well as men and women, were subject to the same laws of nature. They lived, grew old, and died. But a bit later they came to believe that only the bodies of the gods died. Their spirits were eternal. Thus they provided a place for the spirits of the dead gods, just as they provided a place for dead human beings. The concept of the Duant was vitally important to the ancient Egyptians. They visualized the world of the living as a place between the sky above and a region below the earth, which they called Duant. During the daylight hours, Ra sailed over the sky from east to west in the boat of day, setting at last in the western horizon. Ra then entered the boat of night and began his journey through the Duant across the waters of the nether sky below the earth. The word Duant itself came into being during the time of the primitive Egyptians, and the exact meaning of the word was lost to the later Egyptians themselves. Sometimes modern Egyptologists translate this word as underworld or netherworld. Both of these terms are incorrect and imply certain concepts that do not actually apply to the Duant. By the 19th dynasty, we know for sure that the Egyptians did not consider the Duant beneath the earth, but somewhere in the heavens where the gods themselves lived. It was considered the realm of Osiris, where the dead were judged for their deeds on earth, and where Osiris reigned over the gods and all of mankind. It was where the weighing of the heart took place. One soul was weighed against the feather of truth, the emblem of Mot. The soul stood in the balances. If it was too heavy with sin, Amemet, the devourer, would consume it utterly, and one would be lost for eternity. But if your soul was judged worthy of the mott feather, that is to say, it was devoid of sin, you would get to go to the happy hunting grounds with the gods." End quote. It is this concept of the Duant and the funerary text titled The Book of Gates that was the basis of the visionary work in the upcoming book, The Visions of the Pylons, a magical record of exploration in the starry abode, and in which an experimental expedition into the Duant was performed some years ago. The date was between 1975 and 1977. Their pylons, the pylons of the Duant, were scried by the author, J. Daniel Gunther, and scribed by the dearly departed and true of voice, Richard Gernon. Now, enough from me. Let's hear what the author and guest has to say. Daniel, can you tell me about the origin of the Book of Gates and how it may differ from other funerary texts such as the Book of the Dead?
Certainly. The evolution of the Book of Gates as one of the books of what is commonly called the books of the netherworld or the books of the underworld, it really didn't take place, as you said, until the 18th dynasty. And from internal evidence, it seems quite clear that it evolved during the reign of the heretical Pharaoh Akhenaten. As a text, it's quite different from other funerary texts of the Egyptians because the text of the Book of the Dead, for example, they all vary. They're different one from the other. The texts are also quite distinct from the vignettes that decorate these copies of the Book of the Dead. The Book of Gates, however, is totally unique. The images and the text themselves make up a unity. They're not divided at all. And the text of the Book of Gates does not vary from one year to the next. As I said, if we look at a variety of texts of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, they're all a little different. Some of them include spells that others don't, and so forth. Some are quite short, some are quite long. But the Book of Gates were constant. They represent a unified whole, and we first find them. The first example we know was found on the sarcophagus of Seti I, and also in his tomb. And more complete versions were found later all throughout the period of the 18th dynasty.
Now, as you said, the Book of Gates, it was set. It didn't vary from tomb to tomb.
Right.
These pylons have guardians.
That's right. The Book of Gates, what we call, they use the term gates, and I use the term pylons as an older term. They were 12 in number because they represented one for each hour of the night. And each of these gates had a doorway, and to pass through the doorway, one had to know, of course, the secret words of power. And each gate was guarded by a fierce guardian, a serpent one, and the person passing through the pylons would also have to know the name of the guardian. And the deeper one goes, the more complex they get, and the more perilous they actually become. But as they're laid out from hour 1 to hour 12, they represent symbolically the passage through the night.
Okay. From what I can tell, and what I've read in your book, and reading the vision, and reading the Book of Gates itself, this text was intended for use after one was deceased. So why or how is it now that it can be used, in your case, visionary work by the living?
Well, in the first place, when we see the Book of Gates first appear, it was really just for the use of kings.
Okay.
It eventually became expanded so that it included all people. And one of the curious things about the Book of Gates, and one reason we know that it evolved during the time of Akhenaten, is that it demonstrates something very peculiar in that it shows the 5 races of men passing through the Duant, regardless of race or skin color or creed. They're all granted equal access to the Duant because they are treated as creatures that were created by the same God. And this amazing cosmopolitan view that we only find first in the doctrines and theology of Akhenaten. And the great hymn of the Aten, for example, which many people believe he wrote himself, it demonstrates this kind of generous cosmological view, the treating of all people as equal. So eventually the Book of Gates began to be viewed as a place that not just kings could go, or royalty, but all peoples. And, even more striking, not just Egyptians, people of all races, whether they foreigners or not. And that was something quite unique in the Egyptian literature. And in regard to your question, what interested me, at the time, in 1974 approximately, I had already completed my astral work in my task of the grade as I was aspiring to the AA. But something about it, I was dissatisfied. I had showed complete success with it to the, as far as my superiors were concerned, they were happy with that. But I wasn't. I wanted something that had a little more depth to it, something that had some meaning to me. I was able to have visions and without any difficulty. As I began to read the Book of Gates in the Egyptian and translations, as I passed through some of these subjects that I just mentioned, it became apparent to me that the pylons themselves represented more than just, as you say, a passage to the happy hunting grounds of the Egyptians, a place of heaven. But it represented, from a psychological point of view, it represented the unconscious of man. And I was looking at it, of course, from a Jungian standpoint, where the Book of Gates represented a passage into the unconscious, full of archetypes and so forth. I became convinced that the pylons were still accessible, and that I originally thought that the pylons formed the gateways to the Sephiroth. And originally, for example, the first 4 pylons, I assumed, mistakenly as it turned out, I assumed that the first 4 pylons corresponded to Malkuth, Yesod, Hod, and Netzah. And so that was my assumption going in.
Okay.
It proved later to be wrong. I devised a whole magical system at that point, utilizing the training that I had in the AA as far as magical ritual, talismanic magic, and so on, to devise a method whereby I could scry the pylons. And to do that, in order to access the pylons, the Book of Gates is very specific about that. To have access to the first gate, you had to know the name of the gate, you had to know the name of the guardian, you had to know certain magical words and formula in order to pass through. And so it is with all of the gates. And so incorporating all of those things into this magical system, I began what was my experiment to see if I scribed the first pylon, what would happen.
Okay.
And I assumed it would be, I thought it would be the gateway to Malkuth. And I did 4 visions. I scribed 4 pylons before I submitted my record.
And these were done really close in time and the time frame to each other, or did they? Well, I mean, it happened between 2 years, so I would assume.
Yeah, we have that. We could look at the dates.
That'll be in the book. So
it's in the book. I don't have it in front of me, but they were pretty close. And at that time, I submitted my record to my superior in the order, Frater Juvo, who was Marcelo Ramos Mota. He read the visions, and he came back to me and said, he encouraged me to continue, and he said, though, I think you're mistaken that these correspond to the first 4 Sephiroth of the Tree of Life. I think they correspond to these first 4 correspond to the 4 gates of Malkuth. The air, earth, fire, and water quadrants of Malkuth. And he encouraged me to continue the experiment to find out. I mean, that is what is an experiment. That's what an experiment is. And so we then proceeded to invoke the 5th pylon. And at that point, in subsequent pylons, we discovered, in fact, that my instructor was partially correct, that the first 4 pylons do correspond to the 4 gateways of Malkuth, but more than that, they're far more complex than that. That the pylons themselves have hidden gateways that lead other places, and that is one of the most intriguing aspects of the pylons and one of the more complicated ones.
That's a good point. But we won't talk any more about that. If you want to know a little bit more about that, you'll have to go get the book. Okay, so we talked a bit about what inspired you.
Right.
Well, like I said earlier, this work was done in a relatively short period of time between 1975 and 1977. And that was some time ago.
Right.
And it's not being published until now. And I was wondering if you could maybe just say maybe why now?
Well, at the time, when I was, like I mentioned, I submitted those records to my superior at the time, Frater Juvo, and at that time he was very encouraging, wanted me to continue, and he expressed a desire himself to publish it at that time. But as you know, the unhappy history that followed, which led to my breaking away from Moda, and Moda eventually having his own difficulties, as it were. I had put the records away as part of my magical record, and went on to other things. I just had my mind on 1,000 other things, and really didn't give it much thought. It was something I had done, an experiment I had done, and learned from, but I put them away until one of my students who had come to visit me about 25 years later was going through my bookshelves and found the record of the visions of the pylons on the shelf, and he brought it to me and he said, "What is this?" And I said, "Oh, it's something I did a long time ago." And I remarked to him offhand something about it not being worth the paper it was written on. And he asked me, may I read it? And I said, "Of course you can read it, and if you want to." And he took it away and went up to his guest room and locked himself away for a couple of hours or the afternoon. And after he had read it, he came down the stairs and said, "I beg to differ. I think this is worth more than the paper it's written on, if nothing else than the fact that it's a record of an experiment that was conducted by 2 aspirants of the AA, and it needs to be examined, it needs to be studied, and, because there's a lot here." A lot seemed to him important, and actually after 25 years, I myself went back to read it again. I hadn't really read it in a very, very long time. And I was surprised to find there were many things revealed in the pylons that at the time of the vision, I didn't understand a word of. But after 25 years, I came to see that there were often references to things that had come over the years to become a really important part of my initiatic life. I didn't have the wit to see it at the time that we had the visions, but looking back on it with hindsight, I could see that as far as my own growth and my own personal growth, it was important. And that student and 2 or 3 others read it, and they really began to encourage me to make that record known publicly, and so I decided to do that and just make that record known, because it's as far as everything that's out there, it's kind of unique in a lot of ways, in that it essentially the book is a new Grimore that has an entirely new magical system, a means and explanation of how to do this yourself. Anybody who wants to invoke the pylons and explore the pylons, with the instructions in this book, they can do so. And we did not complete all the visions of the pylons. We only did pylons 1 through 7. We didn't go all the way through 12, simply because of circumstance and what happened at the time. Those pylons remain to be explored. So the information is there for someone who wants to do the experiment, pick up that experiment, and continue. And
Would you suggest that they start from the beginning?
oh yes, absolutely.
Yeah, start from the beginning.
You
for
have
sure.
to.
Yeah,
If
it's
you
the only way you can get to number 2 is to
yes,
number 1.
they won't let you. They won't let you to 2 till you pass through
Okay.
1. I can
All
promise
right.
you that.
Okay. I want to make a little comment on my question as to why it's being published now. You said Moda wanted to publish it, but that didn't happen.
Right.
And you've recently come out with other books. Most people are aware of your initiation in the Eon of the Child series. And we needed a publisher. And Jim Wasserman, who's a friend of yours and who also has quite a few books out on the occult studies and other novels that are quite interesting, he offered to pitch your book to Ibis Press, right?
That's correct.
And that was just maybe about a year and a half ago. And so it's that process, that opportunity that just sort of sprang up. That is another reason why it's being published now. So, I mean, you'll be able to find this book on Amazon or through www.jdanielgunther.com.
Right.
Just to put that in there.
Right.
And it also takes a lot of work and editing to get a book out there.
Well, does it ever?
I would say this was definitely a labor of love.
Yes, it
But
was. It was
well
difficult.
worth it. Yeah.
It was very difficult. Well, our books are difficult in lots of ways because we use a lot of foreign language fonts, for example. When you're dealing with, incorporating magical symbols, zodiac symbols, Hebrew attributions, and so on, it gets pretty complicated. And this particular book also has a lot of, not only does it have a lot of Egyptian hieroglyphics, but it has a lot of magical drawings and so forth.
And magical instructions.
And
Very,
magical
very detailed
instructions.
on how to do the work.
Yeah.
All right. Although the Book of Gates is a magical teaching of the prior eon, that of Osiris, and is specifically based on Egyptian theology, and I use the word theology loosely, in your visions, what did you discover that pertains to the new eon, that of the child?
Well, that is an interesting question. It's something that I didn't foresee when I began the Pylons. I really had never even thought about it that way. But as I began to explore the Pylons, I discovered that the guardians, some of the guardians in particular, expressed knowledge of Thelema, and they indicated that they in fact accepted the law of Thelema. And that is known also to us from other visionary works such as the Vision and the Voice. I had never considered that, but when I got into the Pylons, it became apparent that these guardians, they had accepted the law of Thelema, and they had included that in some of the requirements they made for us to pass to another place, another position in the Pylons. And they challenged us, and sometimes they challenged us as Thelemites, and they were challenging us as fellow Thelemites.
Now, I have a question because you're saying they challenged us. Do you consider you and Gurney, since he was the scribe, as sort of as being a sort of a joint experience?
Yes, absolutely. In many cases, the scribe could see what I saw.
Oh, okay.
Not always. I didn't have enough wherewithal at the time to document in detail at what points he could see what I was seeing. But most of the time he could. Sometimes he couldn't.
Okay.
And what caused that, I don't know. But he was a very gifted scribe. He was knowledgeable in a great many things. He was a perfect person to use as a scribe. And he also had great visionary gifts. And sometimes after we had recorded the Pylon, recorded the record of the Pylon, we would sit down and discuss aspects of things that were in the Pylons, and he was often able to correct something that I said, or he would say, what I was trying to describe, what I seen, he gave it more detail. He would say, well, it was actually this and that, because he could see it too.
Okay.
And I found that really quite remarkable. So when I say about exploring the Pylons, I say we, because it really was a joint effort. Without him and his expertise, it would have been very difficult to do some of that work.
And this I know we talked about this. In order to scry the pylons, one does need a scribe.
Oh yes, I discovered that pretty quick.
Okay.
Into my exploration of the pylons. Unlike when I was doing private astral work, I was able to recall and write down and transcribe everything that had happened. And very quickly into this experiment, I realized this was deep water, and I was not going to be able to do all of this by myself and recall everything, and that proved to be true. And so I needed someone who was very talented, and Richard was familiar with Egyptian hieroglyphics, Greek, Coptic. He was very familiar with the Western magical tradition. He was familiar with so many aspects, of the great work, ritualistic magic and ceremonial magic that we did. He just proved to be an enormous, enormous aid.
Yeah.
And sometimes I had, when the vision, at certain points in some of the visions, I had no memory of what transpired. In a couple of cases, one case I had a samadhi during the vision, and what took place there during that time, the only record we have is what Richard wrote down. He witnessed it and was able to record what transpired during that period of my silence.
Oh, wow. Well, I know that there are a lot of people waiting and hoping that this book comes out soon. I believe August is the expected.
Well, we hope it'll be a little bit sooner than that. The book went to press this last Monday.
Okay.
And hopefully it'll be around the 1st of July. But with book production, there's always ups and downs in the way things go, but that's what we're shooting for.
Now, there's a beautiful drawing, on the frontispiece of this book?
On the dust jacket.
On the dust jacket. Oh, well, there's two, actually, that I wanted to just bring up. There's the dust jacket, which was done by Nancy Wasserman, which is beautiful.
Correct. Yeah.
It's taken from one of the pylons, and it's been a lot of color added to it, and a beautiful night sky.
She interpreted it. It's a scene of one of the scenes in the Duant. Shows the boat and the passengers in the boat, and below that it shows the individual fending off the perils of Apep, the serpent. And she took that painting right from the tomb wall and, incorporated her great talent to brighten up the image and show the night sky. I mean, she's just done a beautiful job. I think it's a lovely thing, and it's very representative of the book. And
there is another piece of art in the book.
There is.
That was a gift to you.
There is.
By our friend and artist, Robert Barati.
That's correct.
Would you like to say anything about that?
Well, I would like to give a little background on that. There was a photograph of me that had been taken early 1975, and one of my students had seen that photograph, and he was quite inspired by it, and he knew I was working on the visions of the Pylons as a book. And actually what happened was he had a numinous dream, or vision, if you will, in which he saw that photograph redrawn in a very particular way. And being acquaintances with the great Australian artist Robert Barati, he secretly commissioned Robert to make this drawing of me, and then it was later presented to me by Robert himself as a portrait of me, which forms the frontispiece of the new book. It's called The Magician, and when I first beheld it, I nearly fell to the floor. It doesn't just show me. To my right is the Egyptian goddess Mot, and to my left is Tahuti, or the god Thoth, who's the scribe. And what shocked me about it, and what my student did not know, was that during the invocation of the Pylons, I, as the seer, had assumed the god form of the Egyptian goddess Mot, and the scribe assumed the god form of the Egyptian god Thoth. Neither of those people knew that, and yet, when I saw the portrait, that's how it was portrayed. It's really quite remarkable. And as I said in my lecture, Robert did not know that fact when he drew that portrait, and nor did the student know who commissioned it. But the gods remembered it. And I believe they guided Robert's heart and hand so that he might bear witness across the long years of that fact. Because I believe the gods of ancient Egypt still live and they still talk to us. All we have to do is be silent and listen.
Well, thank you, Daniel. I think this is a good point to wrap up this podcast. But before I go, I just want to say again where you can find the book. It's going to be on Amazon. You just have to look for The Visions of the Pylons, or you can visit J. Daniel Gunther's website, which will give you a portal to it, www.jdanielgunther.com. And I would also like to thank everyone involved, especially the Wassermans and Barati and everybody behind the scenes for getting this book out. Thank you for listening. Until next time, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love under will.
Thank you.